What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and Eternals officially comes out today at the time that we're recording this video, and I'm going to see it at 6 p.m. tonight with my girl. So, if you guys are curious about my review on the Eternals, then make sure you guys check out Geek Culture Explained tomorrow, because that's where I will be talking about it. Having said that, in this video, I want to talk about the Deviants, and I want to do a little bit of a deep dive here, right? And there's two different reasons why we're doing that. One is because it'll just provide more meat and potatoes for the video, and two, when it comes to making a video explaining the Deviants, you have the Deviants as a race themselves, which are largely irrelevant after the fourth host, and then you have like Crow of the Deviants, who is really the only relevant Deviant in the history of the entire race, right? So we might do a video on him at a separate point in time. Let me know in the comments section if you guys want to see a video on Crow specifically, but the Deviant race itself is really cool, and they're really significant. It's just Marvel never really did a whole lot with them, right? So we've kind of talked about this history of like the Eternals, the Deviants, and mutants, and all that kind of stuff over the course of the life of the YouTube channel, but something that I want to do here is something that we never did in our video on mutants, and we never really did in our video on Eternals. I want to talk about the nature of the experimentation that was done with regards to the Deviants that actually turned them into who they are. So something I want to clarify here is that the name Deviant is not unique to Earth, right? That's not simply just referring to that race as it exists on Earth. That's a general term given to any race whose genes were modified basically by Xeron the Tester to reflect the goal that he was achieving, which is destabilize genes. So to give you guys perspective here, the name Deviant is like the name politician, right? Like here on Earth, when you use the name politician, you're not referring to a particular person, you're referring to a role a person plays. They are a politician. Those people are politicians, right? That kind of a thing. And so Deviants follows the exact same way. A really good example of this is the race of Skrulls, which you guys are probably aware of from the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the Captain Marvel films, that when the Celestials showed up on Skrullos, the home world of the Skrulls like 100 million years ago, that they did exactly what they did on Earth. They took a portion of that race and they modified their genes so that you basically had the Eternal Skrulls, the Deviant Skrulls, and then baseline Skrulls that had no real special powers, but at some future point in time, those powers would manifest. What happened on Skrullos is the Deviants wiped out the Eternals and the baseline Skrulls. And so all you had left were Deviant Skrulls. And that's why when you look at the race as it exists now, you see these kind of hallmark traits, these things that seemingly span from one race to the other based on the experiments of the Celestials. For example, Thanos is technically an Eternal. However, he possesses the Deviant gene, and that's why he has that crazy looking chin that makes him look like he's similar to the race of Skrulls, because at the end of the day, the Deviants all share a kind of experimental archetype that more or less seem to result in them looking something similar to each other across the entirety of the universe. Now, why that's the case, we don't really know. We have no idea why the Celestials do what they do. We just know that they do that kind of stuff. But that's an example of where an entire race of Deviants had basically conquered the world on which they live. Now, getting into the meat and potatoes of this and the important explanation about all this stuff, the Deviants are wildly interesting, right? They're really fascinating. So one of the things that we talked about in our Eternals and our Mutants Explained videos and Celestials videos, things like that, is that the Celestials visited the Earth about 1 million years ago and started experimenting on people. Now, this kind of early primate man sort of thing, they were referred to as the Wanderers, right? Kind of the missing link between primate man and modern man. And the idea is that they were split into 3 groups. Now, this kind of splitting up was done by a Celestial named Gammonon the Gatherer, but you had Xeron the Tester, and then you had Nazar the Calculator, and then you had Oneg the Prober. Nazar the Calculator is the name of the Celestial that created the Eternals, and Oneg the Prober is the name of the Celestial that created basically mutants, or at least set things up so mutants would emerge at some future point in time. Xeron the Tester is the one that we care about. Now, we don't really know much about this guy. Like most of the Celestials, we don't really know much about the nature of Xeron the Tester, outside of the fact that he's a Celestial, he can modify genes, do virtually anything he wants to, and he's just uber powerful, right? That's really all we know. He kind of falls rank and file with the way you normally see Celestials. But the purpose here, as he'd done on so many worlds, was to simply destabilize genes, right? To create unchecked mutations to kind of defy evolution. And this is an exceedingly important thing, right? Because when it comes to evolution, evolutionary change is usually a response to an environment. So say, for example, the surface of the Earth became uninhabitable for any number of reasons. Climate change, nuclear war, I don't know, like Galactus comes to Earth and just farts and it just lingers for like 1 million years. Whatever the case happens to be, right? We as humans may end up descending underground, right? We'll just take up residence in underground caves and caverns. What will happen if we spend enough time there is that over a series of generations, our biological structure will begin to change to adapt to that environment. So maybe we gain enhanced eyesight so we can see in the dark, or maybe eyesight's abandoned in its entirety because we don't need it to see in the dark, and our other senses begin to expand. Our senses of hearing, our senses of touch, different things along those lines. Perhaps we even develop some form of echolocation, but that takes generations upon generations upon generations based on that quick and sudden change to our environment as it exists. Assuming that our environment here on the surface largely remains unchanged, that there wouldn't really be a huge differentiation between humanity as we exist now and humanity as it exists in like 10 generations. With deviants, it doesn't work that way. There's no such thing as a quote-unquote normal deviant as there is with like a quote-unquote normal human, right? Eyes on the front of our face, so we have depth perception, 5 fingers on each hand, 5 toes on each foot, sentience, higher level thinking, the kind of traits that we would ascribe to what we call a normal human being. That doesn't exist among the deviants. That what deviants have is a kind of window, or what deviants have described as being an acceptable range of traits among their race. And so what you got here in the early days of the deviant race, and this is particularly important, is that following their creation, it was really of one, at least from an immediate sense, trying to understand how their race would form and how their race would function, what kind of empire it would look like, things like that. You saw a kind of priesthood arriving, and what they would do is that in creating this range of acceptable traits, that they would take anybody who was deemed to be outside of that range of acceptable traits, and they would either execute them or they would exile them. And there was no arguing it, right? There was no in between there. Now, this is on top of what was basically the violent nature of deviants, and the fact that even among a deviant family, there would be a sort of coldness and callousness there. In a lot of ways, it was kind of every man for himself. There wasn't really any unification among the race, which is one of the significant roles that Crow played among the deviants, was actually unifying them in a way that just hadn't really been done before. But outside of that priesthood concept and getting rid of those individuals who were deemed as mutates because their mutations were so extreme, even for the deviant race, and their exile or executions, or individuals who simply hadn't mutated enough, you had the deviants waging war against the Eternals. Now, a lot of this was just done for dominion, right? Just the person to run the world, at least the attempts that the deviants had. And for the most part, they controlled a huge portion of it, right? Because deviants evolved so incredibly fast, in the sense that you might have a deviant who is moderately intelligent, then their offspring is just a genius level intellect. Or you might have a deviant that has super strength, and then their offspring has shape-shifting, super strength, and the ability to fly, or something along those lines, right? I'm just arbitrarily grabbing, character traits or powers to just kind of illustrate a point here. But because you would see such extreme and rapid changes among their race, that what you found is that deviants far outstripped the capabilities of baseline humanity. Now, the Eternals never really had to contend with that because the Eternals were engineered to be perfect beings. So their knowledge of technology, science, all that kind of stuff was light years ahead of humanity. But deviants were catching up very, very fast. The reason why this matters is because where I previously, and this is actually a mistake that I've been making over the years, I always thought Lumeria, in terms of where the deviants resided, was the capital city of Atlantis. It's actually not. It was their kingdom in the Pacific. That Atlantis was its own thing out there, in the Atlantic Ocean. But the deviants themselves had basically ruled the world from their capital city of Lumeria. Now, a lot of this happened because the Eternals just didn't care, right? They had totally abandoned their role of safeguarding humanity. They were just kind of out there doing their own thing, giving no real thought to what was happening around them. And so this allowed the deviants, with their rapid intelligence growth based on their evolutionary progress happening so incredibly fast, to actually enslave the whole of humanity as it existed at the time. The only safe haven that you had there was Atlantis. And the reason why Atlantis was a safe haven is because this was a trading hub. It was neutral territory, right? It was the only real place where deviants and Eternals and humans, at least those humans who hadn't been conquered, could live without fear of being, executed or enslaved or something along those lines, right? It's neutral ground. Nobody harms anybody, right? Everybody just kind of does their own thing. It's a safe haven. Now, while it's never explicitly stated in Marvel Comics, the enslavement of humanity by the deviants had actually set humanity back a pretty good period of time. And the reason why is because while human beings with traditional powers hadn't really manifested, and if they did, Marvel's never really revealed it to us, there had to be individuals out there that had enhanced intellects. But if they did have those, nothing ever came of it, because baseline humanity was used as a labor force. They weren't taught to read, they weren't taught to write, none of that kind of stuff, right? They were taught to go there and smash those rocks and keep doing it until I tell you to stop, right? That's basically how they were used. Now, as we've mentioned in previous videos, the first coming of the Celestials to modify the genes of the Wanderers to create the Deviants and the Eternals and the baseline humans, that this was referred to as the first host. The second host was the Celestials coming to basically check up on their experimentation. Now, the big thing about this is that with the Deviants having conquered so much of the world, basically everything outside of Atlantis and the various territories that were ran by the Eternals, but also also warring with the Eternals in an effort to attain the Eternals' lands and destroy the Eternals in their entirety. When the Celestials showed back up, they were pissed. Now, some of this had to do with the Eternals abandoning their role of safeguarding humanity, and some of it had to do with the fact that the Deviants had actually attacked the Celestials because they saw them as a credible threat, trying to stand in the way of their ability to rule the world. The reality is the Celestials were angry because their particular interest here with this experiment was baseline humans. What would they become? What would they be capable of? That was really the main meat and potatoes here, right? To see the end result of this baseline gene experimentation coming to fruition in whatever form it took. And the Deviants enslaving humanity had basically halted that, and the Eternals doing nothing to stop humanity's enslavement and allowing the Deviants to enslave them in the first place had pissed off the Celestials even more. And so what you saw here is what was referred to as the Great Cataclysm. And despite the Deviants' higher level of intelligence beyond humanity, allowing them to achieve advanced weaponry, advanced technology, things along those lines, and despite the fact that humanity was still relatively primitive, this basically led to the Deviant capital city of Lumeria being totally eliminated to the point that most every single Deviant across the world was destroyed. Where previously Deviants had existed in the millions, at that point they've been reduced down to a few thousand. Now this is particularly important, and the reason why is because following this Great Cataclysm, the Eternals were instructed by the Celestials to ensure the safety of humanity, but not to interfere with humanity. So if they had to go into human cities and do anything, they had to blend in. No one could know the Eternals existed. The Deviants kind of learned their lesson, right? So they ended up just taking off underground and had largely remained there ever since. But this is Marvel's way of explaining how it is that one, just these super advanced pieces of technology have just kind of been discovered around the world with no real explanation of how they existed. But more so than that, the Great Cataclysm was offered as an explanation to basically illustrate why it is the world could be so technologically advanced under the rule of the Deviants and then suddenly seem to start from zero. Because with humanity not understanding any of what they were seeing with regards to the technology that the Deviants had in their possession, that when the Great Cataclysm took place, that the Eternals seemingly vanished and the Deviants went underground, the world belonged to humanity now. And so it basically started over. Now following that, one thing to know about the Deviants, you had a few things here and there. You had a few instances, some conflicts and stuff like that happened, but as an entirety of a race, they never really mattered, right? I mean, you did kind of have a truce that was struck between the Deviants and the Eternals and baseline humans, and what was referred to as the Damocles Foundation. Of course, they were created back in X-Force issue number 79 in 1998 and were based out of Portland, Oregon, but even they weren't necessarily a true unification. I mean, they were, but it was more of one of these things where they believed that the dropping of the atomic bomb had begun an age where it essentially just fast-tracked humanity destroying itself. And so in an effort to prevent that from happening, what they intended to do was actually create a race of super beings that would basically rule the world and would end all war, right? It's better that humanity rule under what some would define as oppression than see the whole of humanity wiped out. And so because of that, the Damocles Foundation, of course, ran into conflict with S.H.I.E.L.D. and things like Operation Zero Tolerance, led by Bastion and so on. But all in all, the race of Deviants following the Great Cataclysm, well, I take that back. Okay, so one of the things that happened during Charles Knopf's Eternal run is that you actually ended up learning that the Deviants had worshipped the Celestials. But when the Celestials initiated the Great Cataclysm, the Deviants ultimately abandoned worshipping the Celestials as a whole. And then upon discovery of the Dreaming Celestial, had basically made this declaration that they believed the Dreaming Celestial was the one that they should worship. And the reason for this is that while the other Celestials out there had served a purpose insofar as creating the Eternals or the Deviants or baseline humans, that Tiamut had actually used his power to create some unique beings. But the Eternals had actually believed that Tiamut was responsible for their creation. Now, that's not accurate. The way it actually played out is that in the early days during the Second Host, when the Great Cataclysm was being initiated, that because the world had demonstrated that it was basically a world ran by the Deviants, that what was supposed to happen is the world was going to be cleansed by the Celestials themselves. The energy would be sent to the Fulcrum, who is basically the being that all the Celestials serve, and then it would be sent to the Horde, which is basically the antithesis of the Celestials. It's kind of a loose definition here, or a loose assignment here, but the Celestials would kind of represent good, and the Horde would sort of represent evil. And so if a world basically is more deviant than it is anything else, it would be what you would call an evil world. Now again, those are loose terms, right? They're not absolute constructs, but that's what was supposed to happen. Instead, because Arishem the Judge had judged against the Deviants and simply initiated what was almost a complete culling of the Deviants, that Tiamut the Dreaming Celestial had attacked Arishem the judge, believing that he was basically malfunctioning. This led to the other Celestials attacking Tiamut the Dreaming Celestial and then imprisoning him in Earth. But over the years, the story of Tiamut the Dreaming Celestial trying to save the Deviants turned into Tiamut the Dreaming Celestial created the Deviants. And so that kind of change in mythology over the years led to the Deviants basically vacating or moving away from worshiping Celestials as a whole and worshiping the Dreaming Celestial, which they actually managed to bring back. Now, following that, it just kind of sort of follows Tiamut's own individual story, which is really, really cool. But nonetheless, right, beyond that, any history involving the Deviants in Marvel Comics is largely Crow's history, right? It's the history of his individual character, because the race of Deviants as a whole doesn't really have a whole lot to give there as far as Marvel is concerned. They're just a race that was created by the Celestials somewhere along the line. They fought the Eternals for a while, they conquered the world, and then the Celestials showed up, wiped out most of them, and they've basically been underground ever since. That's it. That's all you really get in Marvel Comics. Well, with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.